In this video, we will cover an introduction to religious studies. We want to discuss religion and ask the question, what is religion? The reason for this is because religion is something that we see across the world, not just in America. There are many different types of religions, some that are a lot bigger and have more adherents than others. But understanding what religion is as a foundation is important so that we can study these religious traditions individually as well, and how they affect politics, life, and culture around the world. If you look in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, or a variety of religious theorists' books and books about religion, you'll find various definitions of what religion is. But it's actually a really difficult concept and word to define, simply because it's so broad and encompassing. For example, we consider Buddhism to be a religion, and we also consider Christianity to be a religion. However, Buddhism does not have a concept of God, while Christianity has a concept of one singular God. We throw Hinduism in there as well, which has a concept of multiple different gods. We consider all of these to be religions, but they're very different. So we want to think about ways in which we can define religion to have an understanding as we move forward of what kind of things are characteristics of religious traditions. Now, over the past couple centuries, various religious theorists have attempted to define religion. For example, James Martineau defines religion as the belief in an ever-living God, that is, in a divine mind and will ruling the universe and holding moral relations with mankind. Now, reading this, you can automatically see a problem with this definition. This religion is a belief in an ever-living God. So, when we talk about religions, again, like Buddhism, that don't have a belief in a God, then this definition does not really work for discussing religious traditions as a whole. Emil Durkheim defines religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. Again, we can see some issues here. Using the word church signifies that we're talking about a Christian tradition and comparing other traditions to that, which is problematic. We also see this idea of a community, and while this may be the case in some religions are also individualistic. Paul Tillich defines religion as the state of being grasped by an ultimate concern, a concern which qualifies all other concerns as preliminary, and which itself contains the answer to the question of the meaning of life. Now, Tillich's definition is a little bit better. This definition isn't, off the bat, excluding certain religions from being under this umbrella of religion. There's an idea of an ultimate concern, which we'll talk about here in a bit, or a concern about the preliminary, what it means to be alive and on this earth. Now, the problem with Tillich's definition is that Tillich is essentially saying that religions answer this question. And while this is true of some religions, not all do. Clifford Geertz provides an anthropological perspective, saying that religion is a system of symbols, which acts to establish powerful, persuasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in people by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence, and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. Now, Geertz's definition is a four-part definition, which can function well for some religious traditions. However, Geertz kind of takes a step back and looks at religion as a cultural phenomenon. He doesn't show that a religion can be something more than just observable, that it can have some kind of psychological and sociological impact on people, but simply that it's something that we see in culture. And Sigmund Freud takes a very negative approach to religion, saying that it's comparable to a childhood neurosis. So, as you can see, all of these definitions have their downfalls, and coming up with a perfect definition of religion is essentially impossible. While it's essentially impossible to define religion, we want to take a shot at it and make some basic statements about things that we'll see in common among the religious traditions that we study, at least in this course. So we're going to answer the what of our introduction to religious studies and ask, what is religion? The first idea is that religion is oriented towards the sacred. Now, again, we have some issues with definition here. When I say religion is oriented towards the sacred, I do not mean that religions always have an idea of a deity, meaning God, goddesses, multiple gods, or anything along those lines. The sacred is simply something that's not ordinary. So, in some traditions that don't believe in a deity, the sacred might be an idea of ultimate reality. It could be something like achieving nirvana or moksha, or what our meaning is in being here. And then in other traditions that do have a concept of a deity, this is often what the sacred is. The idea with religion, being oriented towards the sacred, is that humanity, in and of itself, is not the only thing that matters. Religions typically have some kind of scripture. Now, in some traditions, like Christianity and Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and so on, we find scripture to be something that's a written down text. For other traditions, like Native American and African indigenous traditions, scripture might not be something that's written down, but rather oral traditions. What is important is that we see that there are traditions that are either orally or textually passed down over generations that contain key elements of their religious beliefs. Clifford Geertz points out that religions are sets of symbols, and while he may be stretching it a bit with saying that this is all that religions consist of, we do see a lot of symbology in religion. For example, we see symbology in Islam with the idea of the Hajj to Mecca and the Kaaba. We also see idea of symbols in Christianity with the image of the cross, of the ichthus fish, and we see symbols of religion in Judaism with the Star of David, with the menorah, and so on. Many different traditions have symbols, and these make up a key component of the tradition. And we often have a sense of community. Now, the community does not mean that these religions must gather together to define what religion is, but it does mean that there's a sense of identity within a community of people who have the same religion. For example, somebody who lives in India and somebody who lives in Nashville, Tennessee might both be Hindus and might both feel like they're connected to this bigger community of Hinduism, even though they live in different places. And finally, we see rituals as part of religion. Rituals don't have to be extravagant. We do see those. In ancient Judaism, we see animal sacrifice as a ritual. In modern day Judaism, we see bar and bat mitzvahs as rituals. Rituals are often these big events, but they also can be small ones. Acts like praying, or a woman covering her head in Islam. Acts like meditation in Buddhism, or yoga. These kind of things can be rituals for a religious tradition. Now that we've looked at some of the key components of religion and made a general definition that works for at least most of the traditions we'll study in this course, we want to ask, why religion? Now, the question here is, why do people seek out religion? Now, obviously, this is not everybody. There are a significant number and growing, especially in the United States, population of people who are atheist or agnostic. Religions do not define morals or are necessary to precede these morals or ethics, but we do see religious people clinging to religion for different reasons. One of these is this ultimate concern that we see Paul Tillich talk about. The ultimate concern in some ways ties in with the sacred and essentially asks the question of why we're here. So in some traditions, we see this idea that a deity created humanity. This is essentially the ultimate concern. We're here because of this creation. In other traditions, there might be a more scientific approach to the why we're here. What's important with this ultimate concern is knowing that there's something greater out there for people who are part of religious traditions. Another part of why religion is the idea of the human condition. This means the question of, why do we suffer? Why do bad things happen to people? And so on. Essentially the questions that people ask themselves frequently. Religion can often offer answers to these questions. And as I noted before, we see a connection to the sacred in religious traditions. And this is often why people join religious traditions in the first place. They feel that there's something more out there. And again, this is not everybody. But some people feel there's more out there that they want to connect to. And religions can offer that path for connection, whether it's to a deity or to a sense of ultimate reality, like nirvana or moksha. So now that we've looked at the what and the why, we want to think about how religion functions. Religion functions in people's lives in determining what their worldview is. People who have a worldview where everybody is considered a sinner from birth automatically think that people are imperfect. Some people who are part of religious traditions who do not have a concept of original sin might look at humanity thinking humanity is perfected, but can fall from that perfection. So being a part of a different religious tradition can affect how people view the world. It can also affect people's ethics. Now, ethics have to do somewhat with morals and how we make decisions between what's right and what's wrong. A simple definition of ethics is moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. Now again, being part of a religious tradition is not the only way to be an ethical or moral person or to define one's ethics or morals. But different religions can give rise to different sets of ethics or morals. These ethics are essential for how people in these religious traditions function in the world, and they often stem from the worldview of whether people are perfect or imperfect, how they view the planet, climate, the sacred, and so on. Looking at Geertz's definition a bit more, we look at how religion functions in culture. Culture can often and frequently be affected by religion, and sometimes is both a product and precedes religious traditions. Religion can often show how people have customs and social behavior in a society, how they create ethnic groups, how they create artwork, music, literature, and so on. Things that bind people together as a culture, group, or society. Religion also offers an identity. As I talked about earlier with the example of a person who is part of the Hindu religious tradition living in India versus somebody living in Nashville, Tennessee, both people, regardless of where they live or where they're from, have this identity that they are part of this religious tradition of Hinduism. We've looked at the what, why, and how of religion functioning in the world, but we also want to think about how we study religion. Now, when we're talking about studying religion, we're talking about studying it in a non-confessional, academic way. So, not from a personal belief system, but simply to study something about the tradition from an objective perspective. One of the reasons that religion is so difficult to define and even to study is because it's so interdisciplinary. When we have subjects like science or math, it's pretty easy to figure out where the boundaries are. You're more than likely not going to read a novel like The Count of Monte Cristo in your college algebra class. You probably won't study the history of the ancient Egyptians in your chemistry class. When it comes to religion, though, pretty much anything goes. You see a variety of different disciplines rolled up into the study of religion because religion is pervasive and kind of everywhere in people's lives. We often study religion from a historical perspective, looking at how religious traditions have unfolded in the past and what their origins are. In this course, we'll look at the historical traditions of the religions we're talking about. When we get to the 5 major religious traditions that we see in the 21st century, which are Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, we'll spend a week talking about the origins and history of the traditions before we move into the 21st century versions of these traditions. Religion also encompasses the cultural. This is how we can see communities or groups or societies behave when they're centered around this religious tradition. What kind of customs, ideas, rituals, and so on are common elements of this culture. In religious traditions, we also will study religion from a sociological perspective. This means that we're looking at how the religion impacts people's social lives. It integrates with culture to some extent. And we might even look at religion from a psychological perspective. How do people feel? What do they think when they experience their religious tradition? And finally, we can look at religion from a textual perspective. This is often a literary perspective, simply reading the text to learn what the authors were thinking when they wrote that text, or what we can get out of the literature of a tradition. Now, this interdisciplinary approach, the 5 items that we have here are definitely not all that we can use to study religion, but these are some of the major ones that we see. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to create a basic definition of what religion is and why it is difficult to define, explain why people are religious, describe and give examples of how religion functions in the 21st century, and identify ways of studying religion academically and non-confessionally.